Good morning, everyone. Nimula. My name is Pamela. I will be the MC for this morning's session of the Green Climate Fund's Programming Dialogue with the Pacific. And my very first responsibility is to welcome you and to introduce Mr. Pa Osman Jaju, who is Director of the Division of Country Programming in the Green Climate Fund, to present the opening address. So I hand immediately over to Pa.
Thank you very much, Pamela, distinguished government representatives, national designated authorities and focal points from accredited entities, including our 5 direct access entities from the Pacific, other international entities who are working in the region, our development partners. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the GCF Programming Dialogue for the Pacific. Allow me also to welcome Mr. Said Hussein, the acting CEO of the Fiji Development Bank. As some of you may be aware, this event was initially planned to be held in Fiji in 2020, where we would have had the opportunity to be jointly hosted by the government of Fiji and the Fiji Development Bank. While we in the GCF are all sad that we are not in Fiji this week, we're delighted to have you all join us today and over the course of the next 2 weeks to work together in building the Pacific Project Pipeline with the GCF. I would like to deeply thank all of you today for taking time from your extremely busy schedules to join us for this Pacific programming event. We know that the Pacific is very familiar with issues of climate change and its impact. Today, we are not yet on track to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement and avoid the devastating impacts of climate change. At the same time, we must now grapple with a second crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic, which has severely impacted economies, eroding decades of socio-economic gains. In the Pacific, the tourism sector is one that has been very hard hit, and impacts can be seen across all aspects of the economy. COVID-19 is increasing levels of debt and reducing access to affordable long-term finance, which is critical for scaling up climate action. It is important that we ensure that our recovery can create a paradigm shift towards low-emission climate resilient development, and we are aware that governments in the Pacific are also considering opportunities to regrow their economies in a sustainable manner. The Pacific is a very important region to the GCF. The GCF and the Pacific have laid a very strong foundation together to raise climate ambition, and we are committed to scaling up this support in the region. While you will hear later today on the Pacific Pipeline to date, I want to acknowledge some of the key achievements that the region needs to be proud of. The Pacific has successfully accredited 5 direct access entities to the GCF, 2 regional organizations, SPREP and SPC, 1 sub-regional organization based in the North Pacific, Micronesia Conservation Trust, 1 National Ministry of Finance, and 1 National Development Bank, FM Cook Islands, and the Fiji Development Bank. The GCF recognizes that the issue of direct access is a very important one to the Pacific, and as such is dedicated to support direct access entities to strengthen and grow their GCF project pipelines. To date, our 5 direct access entities, out of our 5 direct access entities, 3 have had projects approved by the GCF board, SPREP, Fiji Development Bank, and MCT. And we are working very closely with the remaining 2 in bringing their first projects through to the GCF board for approval. The GCF has invested a total of over $4 billion into projects, $400 million into projects in the Pacific to date, which has assisted in leveraging financing to bring forward a total of just over $1 billion to the region. Addition to this, the GCF has invested an additional $20 million in the Pacific through its readiness program, which continues to provide institutional support to Pacific national designated authorities, support for Pacific institutions through the accreditation process, support for adaptation planning, support the engagement of the private sector, and also support for Pacific governments to develop their country programs and projects to bring forward to the GCF. To date, all 14 eligible Pacific Island countries have now benefited from both a GCF-funded project as well as GCF readiness resources. While we believe that this is a good start, we also appreciate that there is a lot more that needs to be done. And as such, this event is intended to deepen our understanding of the Pacific context, provide updated guidance from the GCF in terms of how to build robust projects, and will also be providing information to our partners on how the GCF can better support both countries and entities to bring their project pipelines forward. I would like to stress that this event is your event. While we at the GCF cannot travel to the Pacific this year, we hope that those of you in the Pacific or working in the Pacific would utilize this opportunity to build stronger relations with the GCF team that would last beyond this 2-week event. We encourage you to participate actively, ask your burning questions, and get to know the team better. We look forward to strengthening our relationship with all of you working in the Pacific and hope that you would use these coming days to do the same. On this note, I hereby declare the GCF Programming Dialogue in the Pacific open. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pa. Those wonderful opening remarks and setting us off some of those that your comments setting us off clearly for some of the comments on the sessions on the agenda for this morning and throughout the following 7 days. I'm going to hand straight over now, keeping to time here, for the opening remarks from Said Hussein, who is the acting CEO of Fiji Development Bank, having spent almost 15 years at that bank, and so is well knows the situation in the region in this area. And so it's with pleasure I hand over to you, Mr. Hussein.
Thank you, the Director, Division of Country Programming, Mr. Jaju, the Regional Manager, Asia Pacific, Ms. Ndain, Abula Winaka, ladies and gentlemen, the last Green Climate Fund Structured Dialogue with the Pacific, hosted by the Government of Federated State of Micronesia in 2018. Then the Pacific had 9 funding proposals approved to the value of $297.2 million. 8 were from the public sector and 1 from the private sector. A total of 18 readiness proposals to the value of $5.47 million and 1 project preparation fund grant valued at $0.53 million and had 3 direct access entities aggregated. The Pacific now has 23 projects and total GCF financing stands over $400 million for the combined public and private sector. There are now 30 readiness activities with readiness support approved to the value of $19 million. Of this, ladies and gentlemen, about $8 million of readiness support has already been disbursed. The number of funding and readiness proposal has significantly increased, which is a welcome progress. But we still have a long journey ahead of us to access the benefits of working with GCF and see this real impact on the ground. That is through improving the lives of our people, making more resilient as frontliners to the impacts of climate change. The programming dialogue with the Pacific is our opportunity to strengthen our access to the approved readiness support, strengthen project proposal for those already in the pipeline, explore opportunities to access resources and tools to develop and write concept notes, and simply better understand the GCF requirements and expectations. And to contribute to this dialogue It is my humble view that the priority for the Pacific in our bid to successfully engage with GCF must be to firstly complete the accreditation requirements, including any conditions set by GCF, adopt the process, however it is achievable. Track record documentation is identified as a challenge for our region, which I feel can be resolved if we approach this by appointing a dedicated team to manage this process. I may add that it is critically important that at least one of the members is well versed with the organization. When it comes to building our capacity, we engage consultants for our technical policies, while the rest was drafted in-house, all while using our existing expertise and learning along the way. We had a lot of guidance from GCF, for which we are really thankful for. In my view, GCF may assist direct access entities by working with Pacific National Designated Authorities to consider the setup of a pool of GCF accreditation specialists comprising of qualified people from our region. 4 years ago, in 2017, we made history as the first development bank in the South Pacific to become accredited as a direct national access entity by GCF. But the process to obtain accreditation had started in 2015, and our project funding to develop an innovative solar APV project was approved only last year in August. I highlight this, ladies and gentlemen, because initially when we started feeling a bit anxious with the volume of paperwork and the amount of time it was taking us the template, at times we felt that the process was so resource intensive that it felt like nothing was moving. But as we progressed, we began to appreciate the importance of such a process. And trust me, the day we received our accreditation and the approval for our first project funding, those days tell you that the process is not only doable, but worth it. Secondly, the Pacific Direct Access entity's priority must be to finalize its work program. Again, I must admit that the volume and intensity of information required is substantial. It is, however, a necessity to validate the projects before significant resources are dedicated by both Direct Access entity and GCF. However, there are some challenges that can be assisted through the GCF readiness, such as setting up a learning and knowledge sharing platform for the region. Every so often, direct access entities are faced with a lack of relevant data and information that hinders the progress on finalizing our work program, and that also impacts project design. At least from our experience, as soon as our accreditation was announced, we were approached by possible co-financiers and project developers. Given our very little knowledge on GCF, then we had to fall back on our development financing experience to engage in meaningful dialogue. We quickly had to educate ourselves by perusing information on the GCF website, consulted directly with GCF, and that, I tell you, is a benefit of being a direct access entity. Thirdly, disbursing funded activities in an area of priority for the Pacific direct access entities. Unless and until the total financing of $400 million is fully disbursed and the projects are operational, our people will not benefit from the GCF funding, and that is on us.
Yeah. Thank you. So I will continue from where I left. In fact, I was talking on the priorities for the Pacific in terms of successfully engaging with GCF. I was on the second point. So the Pacific direct access entities priority must be to finalize its work program. Again, I must admit the volume and intensity of information required is substantial. It is, however, a necessity to validate the projects before significant resources are dedicated by both the direct access entities and GCF. However, there are some challenges that can be assisted through the GCF readiness, such as setting up learning and knowledge sharing platforms for the region. Every so often, direct access entities are faced with a lack of relevant data and information that hinders the progress on finalizing our work program, and that also impacts our project design. At least from our experience, as soon as our accreditation was announced, we were approached by possible co-financers and project developers. Given our very little knowledge on GCF, then we had to fall back on our development finance experience to engage in meaningful dialogue. We quickly had to educate ourselves by perusing information on the GCF website, consulted directly with the GCF, and that, I tell you, is a benefit of being a direct access entity. Thirdly, disbursing funded activities in an area of priority for specific direct access entities, unless and until the total financing of $400 million plus US dollars is fully disbursed, that the projects are operational, our people will not benefit from the GCF funding, and that's on us. I see that there's opportunity for specific direct access entities to utilize GCF readiness funding at pre-concept node design stage. The readiness funding would include systematic training for the direct access entities. Aside from learning and growth, the region will build capacity to engage more with GCF. This may speed as a systematic diagnostic approach would be undertaken by the same group of people within the direct access entities, from the concept node to the funding proposal stage. Finally, from a risk management perspective, particularly from an on-lending perspective, the direct access entity in the Pacific must collaborate with GCF on foreign exchange risk. It is critical to understand that DFIs, for example, cannot afford to bear foreign exchange risk, as this means it will have to reprioritize its activities and pass on the cost to end beneficiaries. From FDB's experience, getting opinion and models to address such risk comes with a cost. It will be beneficial that GCF bear the foreign exchange risk for national accredited entities. Many times we end up highlighting just broader issues rather than looking at operational challenges where lies the gaps in funding, support, and progress. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I urge you all to use this dialogue platform to focus on how we can learn from one another's experience in order to increase the number of projects that is funded through GCF in the Pacific. So thank you to GCF for organizing this for the Pacific, and I wish my colleagues a fruitful dialogue that would hopefully build a collaborative understanding of Pacific pipeline gaps, priorities, and our way forward. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Hussain, and thank you for persevering with us for those technical problems. We appreciate your energy there. So after that, let me introduce you. I'm sure she doesn't need introduction to any of you. I'm sure most of you know Diane McFazian, who's the Regional Director of Asia Pacific, who has worked tirelessly with her staff and Samantha behind the scenes to pull this all together. So thank you in advance for all of that. And Diane will just do an overview of what the objectives and the intent of the whole session, the dialogue is for this week. So over to you, Diane.
Thank you. I'll just put on a couple of slides as well, if that's all right. Here we go. First of all, thank you everybody for dialing in this morning. I just want to make sure that you can hear me properly. Maybe Pam, if you can confirm that, and then I'll continue.
Super.
Okay, great. Again, thank you very much. A very warm welcome. As our director mentioned earlier, we are very sad today that we're not in Fiji or in the Pacific with you, but we are absolutely delighted that that representatives from the Pacific are able to join us today. I thought I would just give you a little bit of an overview. I do understand that this is the first time that we've had such a event online, and we have been reaching out to many of you, and I want to thank you very much for being so responsive and for everybody's willingness to move into this online platform with us. And I understand that you've been kind of bearing with us as we've been putting this together and learning as we're going, so I want to thank you for that. In terms of how this event is being run, it's a little bit different from previous events, and I want to thank Mr. Hussain already for making mention of previous events that we've held in the region. So many of you will be aware that previously the GCF has held what we've called structured dialogues in the Pacific region, where on an annual basis we used to bring together the NDAs, the accredited entities and other key partners, where we could learn from each other and also share updates from the GCF and also provide direct input into projects. What we'll be doing over the next 2 weeks is that we have a series of 4 plenary events. These are the ones in the screen in the dark blue, and I've put a green circle just to indicate where we are today. So you'll see today that we're starting with the first plenary. We do take a break tomorrow, and then we will be convening again on the Thursday of this week. And then we will be convening again in plenary on Wednesday and Friday of next week. In the plenary sessions, you'll see that a lot of it is we're using the opportunity to provide an overview of support that the GCF has available to both countries and entities. And we're looking at, how we can raise ambition. The Pacific is a very important region to us, and we'd like to see our investment in the Pacific grow. At the same time, you'll see in green that we do have some working groups. The working groups are of a more targeted nature, and these are specifically for invited entities who will be diving deep into some of the projects. In terms of the overall objectives of the event, we very much want to develop, a shared understanding of the Pacific's GCF project pipeline. This is a shared understanding both, across entities working and partners working in the Pacific, but also between the GCF and the Pacific as well. We'd also like to potentially identify more opportunities for collaboration. Again, this is collaboration not only with the GCF in the region, but also opportunities for collaboration between different partners who are working in the Pacific region as well. And we will be using the plenary events in particular to try to ensure a shared understanding of the GCF's investment criteria and also some of the modalities that are available within the GCF to support the development of Pacific projects. So, for example, we'll be updating on some of the new modalities that we have, for example, under the project preparation facility and our readiness program. It's also an opportunity we feel to share lessons learned, so that we are hoping that there will be lots of dialogue, not only hearing from the GCF, but we're also very keen to hear from our partners, from yourselves. You've been working with us now for some time, and we understand that, there's definitely been some challenges, but then there's also been opportunities. And it was very pleasing to hear the CEO from Fiji Development Bank also say that, despite these steep learning curves, that it is worth it. And finally, and this will happen more so in some of the workshops that are happening, we do want to provide targeted support to some of our Pacific direct access entities, in particular to advance their project pipeline. So this is the last slide for myself, just a quick update on what we have remaining on today's agenda. So today we will also be hearing from our Office of Governance Affairs. We'll be getting an update on some of the strategic directions of the GCF, talking about our latest strategic program and some of the updates from our board. We'll also be hearing from Sam a little later today on the current status of the Pacific pipeline. And we also have one of our GCF climate scientists to speak on some scientific tools that are available. And I think one of the sessions I'm looking forward to today is also when we have an opportunity to first hear from some of our Pacific direct access entities who will be sharing with us some of the lessons learned today. So that's it in terms of me from the agenda. But if there are any questions at all, please do not hesitate to reach out to any of us here at the GCF, and we'd be happy to get back to you on email as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Thanks for a great overview. We can see where we're going today. Just want to remind you that we do have the working groups coming up, and they're intense clinics almost to help some of the entities to get the support that both Paul mentioned and Mr. Hussein mentioned earlier. But also in the short presentations that are coming up in the next segment, and then particularly for the lessons learned, you will be able to pose your questions to the speakers and to candidates there. And I'm sure you're all familiar, but I just want to draw your attention to the bottom of your screen where you will see the chat. You may have it open already, but you can put your questions into the chat box. There are 70 of you, so that's wonderful, 71 of you in the meeting today, and so clearly we can't get a question from 70 people. So we have a team of people filtering the chat, looking at the chat, and we'll mine those for the most representative questions to ask here. But don't be dismayed. With those same people will be filtering your questions towards perhaps the working group sessions where they might be more relevant there. And if there are questions that need to be responded, the team will also put together some kind of post-conference package of Q&A, so that, or even reach out to you individually. And so the questions will not be lost, even if they don't get asked this morning or for the rest of the week. They will be captured in some way. So please, if you see there into the chat, that's where you put your questions. Also notice there is a reaction button there. If you want to open that and you want to give your applause to somebody, or you want to give them a thumbs up, or you want to send them some kind of recognition, you can do that through that as well. Okay. And so I'm going to wrap up this first session, thanking all of our speakers for opening us up and getting us started. We will have a 10-minute break, and we will get back sharply at Fiji time 12:40, Korea time 9:40, and for me 2:40 in the morning. So let's take a break, and we'll see you immediately after the break. Thank you very much. Welcome back, everyone. We move into the second part of our program, where we have 3 short presentations, but very informative presentations. And again, if you have questions, please put them into the chat box. And our first one is an update on the strategic program, the GCF strategic program, from Carolina Fuentes, who is from the Office of Governance Affairs at GCF. So Carolina, can I hand over to you? I know you have a presentation and you're eager to go.
Thank you very much, Pamela, and thank you very much to all participants, to country representatives, and to the representatives from the NDAs and from accredited entities. We're very pleased to host this dialogue with the Pacific countries. As mentioned as well, we regret not being there in a physical manner, but it's very good to know that we can have this virtual space to have this type of exchanges with you all. So many thanks for that. This presentation will provide an update on the updated strategic plan for the GCF, and also some of the plans in the agenda of the board for this year. I'll start with that in terms of the update on the strategic plan. This update was adopted by the board at the end of 2020 during the 27th meeting of the board, and it basically sets out the direction of travel for the GCF during the first replenishment period that spans from 2020 and 2023. This is also the window of time of 4 years for the programming of GCF resources during this period of time. So it is very relevant that we do this programming in line with country priorities, and also in a manner that can help GCF achieve the wider objectives of contributing to the Paris Agreement goals and to the realization of the country's specific NDCs. That is the overall framing of the updated strategic plan. The slides, please. Here we have the slides. I'll just give a second for that. To achieve that in the context of the updated strategic plan, there are portfolio targets for the replenishment period 2020 and 2023 that have been set, so we can achieve greater impact during this programming period. The targets that have been set for GCF1 are to maintain the balance 50-50 for mitigation and adaptation resources provided to countries, so the GCF can equally support both mitigation and adaptation. That is one of the main overarching goals in the updated strategic plan of the GCF. As part of this as well, there is the request from the board, as the updated strategic plan was adopted, to maintain a minimum floor of 50% of adaptation resources going to seeds, LDCs, and African states. Just to note that during the initial resource mobilization period, that was just before the adoption of this strategic plan, the GCF achieved a 69% of resources going to seeds, LDCs, and African states. So the aim now is to build on this so we can deliver at least a minimum of 50% of adaptation resources to this set of countries. Also, another important goal is to increase the funding through direct access entities. This is a key priority for the fund. We want to enable the capacities of direct access entities to program more resources in the GCF in response to the needs from countries. And last but not least, also, there is an effort to increase the mobilization of private sector resources. And as part of this as well, to engage much more the private sector in the programming during GCF1. This is also achieved through the work of the GCF around 4 dimensions. First of all, supporting countries in the planning and programming of their actions to address climate change in a manner that is transformational and also that builds on their country priorities and that can take into account the co-benefits of climate action. Also, taking into account that the GCF has the possibility of using a diverse suite of financial instruments. Catalyzing climate innovation is also one of the key areas where the GCF plans to work with countries. The GCF is also well placed in terms of the risk appetite as an organization. So the risk in investment to mobilize finance at the scale is another dimension of the work of the GCF, and mainstreaming climate risk into opportunities and decision-making is also one of the areas that the GCF addresses. This also illustrates how the increased adaptation and mitigation impact is supported when we work with countries to building the country capacities to program in a transformational manner. Also growing a portfolio that has innovation and scalability considerations, catalyzing climate finance from the private sector, knowledge sharing as well as part of these efforts, and all this in the context of being a more accessible and transparent organization. Another important point is that the GCF is an organization that needs to learn by doing and to continue learning as well. And we are also prepared to build on those lessons that we have been learning as we grow and mature as a financial organization. As part of this, the board approved an assessment of the work of the GCF in seats, and there was an evaluation submitted by the Independent Evaluation Unit just in March this year, and a management response to that evaluation as well delivered for the board to consider this evaluation at an appropriate time. Some of the action points that came out from this evaluation, and those are points where we need to improve our work when it comes to seats, are improving the support under the readiness program, also simplifying the project cycle. There is an agenda item on the simplified approval process that is intended as well to simplify the way in which countries program resources and also the whole cycle up to the point of approval of the funding proposals. Promoting a private sector engagement in seats. And finally, as well, introducing the guidelines on programmatic approaches, because we know that these could be of particular impact in the case of seats. Now, here also an illustration of the support that has been provided in the context of loss and damage. As you all know, we have a mandate for the COP to continue to provide support to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. And in this context, the GCF has also supported projects that contain elements of loss and damage, both in terms of the Readiness and Preparatory Support Program, the PPF, and also when it comes to regular funding proposals. And we have the list here in this slide. Now also with regards to the work of the board, there is an agenda of consideration of items during 2021. There is interest as well of closing the policy gaps that still remain. One of those just mentioned, the simplified approval process, but there are some others which are also part of the work of the board during 2021. I would like also to note that the board is coming to a change in membership. We have a 3-year terms of membership for members of the board, and representation from developing countries includes 3 seats for the seats and 3 alternate seats. An invitation to the chair of the regional group was shared last week, inviting the group as well to nominate the representatives for the upcoming term. The term will span from 2022 to 2024. And here we have, in very general terms, a process chart with the steps for the selection process that includes this invitation having been sent to the chairs of the groups, receiving the nominations towards September, and after that, informing the COP in COP26 of the nominations received and updating the membership for the next term. Here is an overview as well of the agenda items that the board is planning to consider during 2021. Of course, this is very tentative because the agendas per board meeting are defined just before the specific meeting at hand. But this is an indication of the list of items that are to come over 2022 and 21, and some possibly 2022. We hope this has been helpful, and of course, we're available and open for any questions that you may have. We thank you for your participation. Many thanks.
Thank you so much, Caroline.
Thank you, Pamela.
I don't see any questions. I'm not getting any, and I don't see any in the chat. If people have them, I'm sure they can direct them to you, and I know that you will respond to them. And so in that absence, then that was super. Lots of information. And I took photos of your slides there. So I'm going to move straight on and to ask Samantha Rabin, Regional Office for the Asia Pacific, to talk to us about the current situation of the Pacific Project Pipeline.
Excellent, thank you. Excellent. So thank you, everyone. Hello, my name is Sam Rabine, and I'm the Regional Officer here for Asia and the Pacific. It's a pleasure to present to you an analysis of the project pipeline in the region. To give you a quick snapshot of the Pacific portfolio to date, there are 16 funding proposals which have been approved by the board, including 13 supporting the public sector and 3 supporting the private sector. Of these funding proposals, 440 million GCF financing has been approved, along with 690 million in co-financing, totaling over 1.1 billion. The portfolio includes 3 proposals which have been approved to date for direct access entities, SPREP, FDB, and MCT, and the other 13 projects are with 6 international accredited entities. Furthermore, approximately 35 grants totaling 20 million in readiness resources has been approved, and all of the countries in the region have access readiness to date. Now let's take a look at the project pipeline. The regional desk undertook an analysis of the Pacific pipeline by consolidating the data in the GCF system and data received in entity work programs. Also, we have confirmed the data with all of the direct access entities and the international accredited entities, and consolidated data aggregated from country programs received. And overall, this analysis resulted in 114 unique projects. And this includes cutting out the duplication of projects which had been excluded. 97 projects were indicated in the country programs. 44 projects were indicated in entity work programs. And the total demand across all the project pipeline is totaling 2.9 billion. 99% of the projects have indicated that it is either grant-based or did not specify the financial instruments at present. And 39% of the pipeline are public sector focused, but only 1% is a private sector focus, and 60% of the pipeline still remains undefined. 72% of the entity pipeline is also a single country focused rather than regional or multi-country. And furthermore, the vast majority of the pipeline is either in the project idea or stage in the country programs or at the concept node stage. So let me share with you a breakdown of the number of projects in the pipeline by results areas. The mitigation projects are included in the blue box on the left, and 33% of all the projects constitute mitigation projects with the highest demand in the energy generation and access, totaling 11.2%. Meanwhile, the adaptation comprises the majority of the projects which have been programmed at 67%, with livelihoods of people and communities with the highest at 22.44%, followed then by health, food, and water security at 14.8%. But let's take a look at this now at a breakdown of the results areas by dollar allocation. So the results areas with the highest demand for resources are infrastructure and the built environment at about 680 million, followed by health, food, and water at about 654 million, and then livelihoods and people and communities at approximately 433 million. So approximately all in all, 2 billion has been programmed in for adaptation projects. And one of the biggest takeaways from this data is that the direct access entities accreditation scope limits the types of projects that can be brought forth. For example, you can see a strong demand in programming for infrastructure in the built environment, but there are no DAEs in the region that are accredited to develop and implement these types of projects. And this present reality reinforces the need for continued partnerships with both DAEs and international accredited entities in the region. Okay, so here's a breakdown of the number of projects by country. And this data on the map has been aggregated based on the project pipelines identified in both country programs and entity work programs. Some countries are still developing their country programs. So countries without the country programs have are only included projects which have been identified in entity work programs for international accredited entities. Great. Now let's take a look at the same data by looking at the pipeline by the dollar amount. Again, this breakdown has been based off both the entity and country work programs. There is a wide distribution and varying demand from across the countries in the region, as you can see. And also there tends to be a much larger demand in both the number of projects and total dollar value in the country programs compared to the entity work programs. Noting that there are only 3 national DAEs to date, this data tells us that there is a gap in the projects that have been programmed in the country programs relative to the direct regional and international accredited entities. And this programming event aims to forge synergies and strengthen partnerships for programming across the region. So this concludes my presentation here. Let me open it up and see if there are any questions at all. And I'm happy to field any of those, or otherwise feel free to put them in the chat, as Pam has already said, and I'm happy to respond to those also through at a later point in time. Let me pause here now. Thank you.
So we're looking, Diane, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. I know I had two people had questions for Caroline. Unfortunately, she had a clashing commitment and she's had to leave. But please, if you put your questions in the chat, we'll be able to direct them and get people to respond to you. If not immediately, then afterwards. I'm pleased. Yeah, there's a question here from Kenneth Kassim. Can you clarify, Samantha, the definition of entity pipeline?
Yes. So this has been taken. Sorry, to clarify, what is entity pipeline?
Yeah, it's a SPREP and SPC are regional direct access entities. Where do they fall?
Yes, so you fall as regional entities. We've also counted you into this. So I can go back. So there were multiple times in the where we were able to show both the difference between the country programs, the data aggregated from country programs, and then entity work programs like SBC and SPREP and other international entities. So that was the differentiation within that data there. GCF recently has switched to having national DAEs to work and have their data integrated into the country program. So when that was available, we just included that in the data for the country programs. Thank you for that question.
Thank you for that. I'm looking to see.
Pamela, just to mention that I'm back, Carolina.
Hi, Carolina. Yeah, someone asked, could we see your final slide on the B29 agenda? Would that be possible for you to do that?
Of course, we'll do that. I think we have the presentation uploaded. So
Yeah.
we'll project now. And just to mention, while a colleague support making the projection of the last slide, that these are the list of items for 2021. In the V29 agenda, we have some of the policy items listed here, those in a dark green. The integrated results management framework and results tracking tool, the updated accreditation framework, the USP capability review, the review of financial terms and conditions that might come afterwards, and the updated committee guidelines. Those are the items expected for B29, with the exception of the review of financial terms and conditions, that may come after. I hope that explains the agenda for B29, and also to mention that in the B29 webpage, the agenda is available. So you can have the full agenda there as well. And we'll paste the link in the chat box for everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Carolina, I think your presentation is available, right, in Hoover?
It should be available.
Yes, yeah. We have some questions, and all of the presentations which speakers are allowing to share, and I think that's most of them, will be available on Hoover. And I think all of you have been given an invitation to that and an option to upload to install Hoover, and you will find all the information for the dialogue in various sections of Hoover, including the presentations. Okay. We have a question here from, is it a comment from Dirk Snyman, who wants to know that the report on adaptation and citizen management still needs to be considered by the board, as the agenda wasn't open during the last board meeting. I think this is for you, Carolina. Will this be considered during the board 29? It isn't clear from your presentation.
Yes, no, and thank you very much for that comment, which is correct. It was not considered by the board in the last board meeting. The document was made available before B28 and is available in the webpage of B28. We have now for B29 an overarching item called evaluations from the independent evaluation unit. We're still to define with the co-chairs the specific evaluations that will come under this item, but this might be one of those. Because as correctly mentioned, this is outstanding. The document and the management response is available, but it hasn't been considered.
Thank you, Caroline. We do have a question. I think Mr. Wayne King has a question for Caroline while she's still here, and we still have time. So would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much, Pamela. I'd like to please make a small comment, and this is obviously a problem that we've had, and I've been asked to start my video. This has been a small issue that I think we're going to face throughout this regional dialogue, because in Ponape, where I participated, a number of us could send out questions on the floor, face-to-face to presentations that were made. Now, this one, I've had my hand up and I've asked for the floor a couple of times. And I think it's on behalf of our participants, there has to be a need and time available to all of us to ask questions on every presentation. If not, what we're getting is information overload and a whole lot of facts and figures with no dialogue. So my suggestion is to now go forward where there is time available for all participants to ask questions verbally, not try and type it all out on the chat box. For those of us who've just switched over from the Paris Agreement negotiation sessions, we're getting pretty tired. So, writing things is not the way to go. However, my comment is actually where I think Dirk had brought up to Caroline, and I wanted to ask her a specific question. The specific question was, and I couldn't see it in the statement that we're going to go to the different boards, but there was a comment made by our delegation which related to direct access entities fast tracking project proposals through the system. I'll tell you the reason why quickly, and that is that some governments have made quite big investments in time and actual money to achieve that accreditation. So the first question is, I never saw that in any of the IEU or any other document or dialogue that's made available, yet we did make that. That's number one, fast tracking. And number two is that the issue around programmatic approaches, even though we made this a large issue around readiness channels, we do not see that evident at the moment in relation to full proposal development. So those are the ones I really just wanted to ask Caroline specifically about if she had any knowledge about those. Thank you.
Thanks, Wayne.
Thank you very much, Wayne, for those very pertinent questions. And you clearly identified two of the items that are very important for recipient countries, and particularly for seats. When it comes to direct access entities and the possibility of fast tracking, at the moment, we're looking into the simplified proposal approval process that is to come to the board as well. We're working on this document based on the comments that were made in the last board meeting, so we can expedite and accelerate as well the manner in which the funding proposals are developed from inception to the point of approval. So that is taking place at the moment in the revision of the paper. We expect as well at some point to have a revised version ready for full board consideration. And we have heard as well in some of the bilateral conversations that we've had with board members, this interest in fast tracking, particularly to support direct access entities. This on the one hand. On the other hand, also the Secretariat is working on a strategy of support for direct access entities that can assist them in a comprehensive manner in different aspects of engagement with the GCF, including when it comes to the submission of funding proposals. So those are the two actions that I can mention with regards to this point. The strategy of support to direct access entities that is more comprehensive, and also the simplified approval process that is to come to the board, and a document is being revised at the moment. Now, when it comes to the programmatic approach, this is one of the outstanding policy items. It's been on the board agenda for some time, and is one of those that will come as well once we have the agreement as well in relation to the items that will come to upcoming meetings of the board. B30 is scheduled to take place in October. We don't yet have the agenda for B30, but this might be one to come then. Just to mention that this is an outstanding item, but of course very relevant.
Thank you, Carolina. I do have, we did have a question here for Mason Smith. I mean, we have 2 minutes before the next presentation is ready. And if you want to ask it, if Carolina wants to give a quick response to your question on private sector, but just to remind you that there is a whole session on that in Plenary 3, and PSF can probably better position to respond to that. But I don't know whether you just want to take a 2-minute stab at that, Carolina, about or Mason, do you want to ask your question quickly?
Of course, I haven't seen the question, but of course, more than open.
It's is there a regional example of crowd in private financing is the question. Mason, did I get that correctly? Do you want to add to it?
If there's a private sector session later on, then it's okay. We'll raise it there, given that we're running out of time.
Yeah, super. Because we do have a whole session there, and it's all dedicated to the private sector component, and we'll have members from PSF will be able to address that at that time. So super.
Thank you, Pamela, and thank you, everyone. I'll be available.
Thank you, Carolina. Okay, so thank you for that, and Wayne, thank you. If people want to raise their hands, please, and as long as sort of numbers permit, we will allow people to speak. We're not trying to prevent anyone, but with 70 people, we thought we would have more questions than we could, people could actually speak out to and stick to the agenda. But please feel free to interact, and we'll make sure that you if you need the floor, you can have the floor. So I'm moving on right now to the third of these presentations, which is the climate change in the Pacific, and Kevin Harburg, our climate science lead from Green Climate Fund, will give us a quick overview on what the latest science is telling us. So we're all fascinated to hear that. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Pamela, and good morning, everyone. Let me just see if I can get my slides up. Good morning, everybody. My name is Kevin Horsburgh. I'm the climate science lead here at the GCF, and it's a real pleasure to be able to have the opportunity to speak with you this morning. I've changed the title slightly from that which was on the agenda because there are many user-friendly climate information platforms already out there to help provide some of the science background that's useful developing strong climate proposals. And I'm going to talk about some of this, a non-exhaustive list. But one, of course, already exists in the region and is a very good source of data, is the Pacific Climate Change Data Pool that was created by the Australian Bureau of Meteorology. Many of you are probably familiar with this. It gives you the option to drill down to observational data and then process it in a number of ways, so it's a useful portal. But I also just want to touch on one that the GCF has been developing in collaboration with the World Meteorological Organization. So it's the GCF WMO Climate Information Portal. I can't sort of drill down and demo in this short space of time, but I'll try and illustrate some of its key features. And I just want to stress that we're looking forward to rolling this product out in the second half of 2021. It's on the verge of an official launch. We are literally waiting for our executive director and the WMO Secretary General to agree that we're ready to take this forward and then work with users and direct access in particular to use this tool. So this is a tool that allows you to, if you can see my cursor, create very quick specific reports about the climate variables that might be useful in a proposal for GCF or any other funder. A more detailed platform where you can access data directly from the climate models that are used in IPCC, and then a sort of statistical tool that's helpful for determining useful climate indices for developing strong proposals. So just as an example to show how this works, I picked Vanuatu as a region, and then selected the more extreme emission scenario for the future to see what we get. And within a few seconds, in fact, with this platform, you can get the top indicators, and then if you drill down into these details here, you can see which models they're based on, and you can see their statistical levels of significance and so far and so on. So this is a very useful tool. So we will be looking forward to working closely with countries, with all accredited entities, and in particular direct access entities, in the use of this tool to help develop strong proposals. And the reason that we're doing this is part of a framework of guidance that we're developing, and I'm leading this just to help proposal developers provide the necessary rationale to create strong proposals that can progress quickly through our system. And so, I think anyone needs to be reminded that for things to be climate relevant, that they have to demonstrate that. So an adaptation proposal needs to show that it's definitely a response to climate threat, not something else. A mitigation proposal has to align with countries' NDCs, but also show additionality. So these very basic essential ingredients are what we refer to as the climate rationale of a proposal. And what we're hoping to do through this framework is make it easier and provide some helpful guidance to develop that rationale. And then for adaptation in particular, there's often a requirement to provide this background science to show the rate at which the climate variable is impacting. And this is something we refer to as the climate science basis. These tools really are there just to help provide all of the information that's needed for the climate science basis. I'm not going to go into this in detail. This is the framework which we're designing. But just to stress how important it is to us that we consult very thoroughly with all of the users of these tools as we develop them. So there will be a very thorough consultative process, taking feedback, refining the system as we work with countries, as we work with accredited entities and direct access entities in particular, to develop these sort of high-level, concise, non-prescriptive guidelines. And they will then drill down and refer to a number of useful climate tools like the ones that I'm showing today. These, of course, will evolve, new tools will become available. And what we would hope to do is keep an up-to-date list here at GCF on a web-based list of tools with user information that directs proposed developers to the best tool for the precise proposal that they're developing. And the WMO tool is very good, but it's just one of them. I have to stress that we don't think a prescriptive approach is desirable. And then very briefly, to the bottom right-hand corner there, something I'm personally working on with the World Meteorological Organization going forward is to try and mobilize, recruit, and organize an international team of climate experts to help use some of these tools, because some of them are very intuitive. They are user-friendly. Some are more user-friendly than others, and some are not user-friendly at all. I think when it comes to developing proposals, to have access to that international team as well as other support from the GCF is going to be useful in the long term. I have to stress this is an aspiration, but it's something I'll be working on closely with the WMO. There are lots of other tools out there, and again, depending on the proposal that's being written, and that will determine the nature of the information that's required. So the World Bank has for a while had a climate change knowledge portal that's very useful. Again, I've just selected Fiji here as an example. So you have the option of looking at some historical observations or some future projections. Just to create this presentation, I chose the future projections, and then this tool goes away, comes back with some very sort of IPCC-like syntheses of the key climate variables that might be of interest, and tells you the climate models that they came from. But it's not always going to be about climate model output. For the Pacific region in particular, sea level, we know, is an existential threat. We know that sea level causes huge damage, inundation, and economic and social damage to many of the small island states. And of course, because the ocean has a data response, there is a commitment to sea level rise. So even if we are successful in stabilizing our greenhouse gas emissions, sea level is going to continue rising for several centuries after 2100. So the fact of the matter is that the global coastline will see 1 meter of sea level rise at some time. It's just a question of when. So for the Pacific region, a sea level information tool might be something that we should consider as a useful technical project. In my previous role, in fact, before I joined the GCF, I worked on something similar to this in the Caribbean region, where we were able to produce a sea level projection tool that allows designers, coastal engineers, coastal planners to compare the difference between different future scenarios of sea level rise, so that you've got the possible information for any project that you're designing. So just to finish off briefly, these information tools, and as I say, that was a non-exhaustive tour of many that are there, and they're evolving all the time, but they're very valuable aids in the development of a strong climate science basis. Our objective in working with yourselves and with the WMO to make these tools even more useful is to accelerate successful proposals, both to ourselves and of course any other funders. The GCF WMO tool is almost ready to be used. We will be rolling this out with very close cooperation with our users over the second half of this year. And it's just part of an evolving framework of non-prescriptive but high-level guidance. The key point, I think, here is that we look forward to working closely with all of our countries, all of our AEs, direct access entities in particular, to provide the necessary training, the necessary assistance, and any other support in the use of these tools, so we can bring forward really strong proposals that move through the pipeline quickly. And I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm looking around and seeing if there are any questions. And I know you are going to be available to be able to work more closely with some in the working groups, I think, more specific climate science questions related to those there. Kenneth Kassim has a question. Do you want to voice your own question there, Kenneth?
Hi, thank you. The WMO, sorry for WHO, the WMO GCF tool looks great, and it'll be really nice to have that access and to know that that's data that is acceptable to GCF and to the ITAP. In the meantime, for projects that are in development now, you presented the Australian climate data sets for the Pacific. Those are the ones that we've been using in projects that we're developing now, but we're a bit nervous about whether those data will be acceptable to GCF and ITAP when we submit them as part of the climate rationale. So how can we make sure that the climate rationale that we're putting together for regional projects will be, for lack of a better word, accepted by GCF and ITAP?
Thanks for that question, Kenneth, which is pertinent, and I suspect many others have a similar question. I am looking forward to getting more involved in the workshop sessions later on in this dialogue, and I will be there for all of those workshop sessions where we can really get into the weeds. The short answer, I think, is that the best way of developing, co-designing really strong proposals comes from the partnership that we have with the developing entity, and from my perspective, from my GCF colleagues, giving the most useful feedback as early on in the process possible. The WMO tool is typically scientific, actually. It's not secret, but it's not launched. There's absolutely nothing to stop you going to climateinformation.org and using it. It's not breaking any rules, and it will provide with some very useful data. So I don't discourage anyone from having a go at that tool. It's not behind any firewalls or anything like that. The other thing I wanted to stress about that framework of guidance that we're developing is we're doing it not just in close consultation with our countries and with our accredited entities, but we're also designing all of those documents in very close cooperation, in some cases co-designing with ITAP. And what we're hoping for is a common sort of authoritative level of expectation on the data that's required for climate rationale. That will take a while to establish all the different elements of that framework. For the time being, please do use the tools that are there. Speak to me or any of my GCF colleagues, and we'd be very pleased to assist you if we think there's some additional data that you haven't yet managed to obtain.
Thank you very much. That's great to know.
Thank you both. I'm going to ask Dirk to ask his question. I know it's around about guidelines, and I know in the working groups, the technical leads will be presenting more detailed guidelines about each sort of technical area. But Dirk, do you want to address your specific question here to Kevin?
Thank you. Yes. Although I think he did touch on a bit of the answer at least, but we find that regardless of which tools we use or which projections, whether it's from tools such as what you've presented or from scientific publications or elsewhere, regardless of which are used, inevitably any review from GCF requests more information, whether it's the type of models used or statistical downscaling or something like that. So, and so we try to be as detailed as possible in each one, and each time there's a request for something that we missed or some more detailed presentation of parameters or whatever the case may be. So my question there was that whether GCF is currently or is considering developing a set of guidelines or parameters or something so that we can be confident that we are using what GCF would accept to be the correct models and correct parameters, whether it's in a matter of what scale we used or which RCP projections or CIMP or whatever the case may be. Thank you.
Thank you, Dirk. And I sort of touched upon that in the previous answer where I said that the best assistance that GCF can give any proposal developer is bespoke and is in the nature of early engagement with the project, which is something that we're promoting here currently within the GCF. We hope to get to a point where, in terms of our internal evaluation of projects, there are minimum and well-agreed criteria that need to be met. So to answer your question in three parts, the first thing is there has to be independent review. The strength of any ultimate project or program depends on the rigor of the way in which it's been reviewed. So there's no process at all that would pre-commit an external review panel like our independent independent technical advisory panel to say, if you do this, then we're going to accept it. Because they wouldn't be doing their jobs as reviewers. And I think everyone has to accept that reviewers will review. But what our job is to make sure that there's the best possible proposal in front of them when they do that. In terms of the interaction with GCF, the request for additional information, my expectation and my hope is with time, the number of cycles that we go through in project development will reduce through early engagement, through making clear the essential ingredients are. I would hope that as this new system evolves, that we then see less requests for information just for the sake of having some feedback. So I think that there will be an acceleration of the cycle in terms of developing a proposal so that it's ready to go to an independent review. And then finally, and for your information, some of those more technical thorny issues, which quite often result in a proposal coming back with a request for additional information, things like the use of reanalysis data, things like the availability of local observations. What we're doing with the independent technical advisory panel is we're actually co-designing a series of technical notes which sit in that toolkit section of the framework that I showed you. And by engaging with them in the co-design of these notes, then we hope very soon to have some information that we can share so that in advance, all project designers know what the expectations are, what the options might be for data poor situations. So I hope that there's some way to answering your question, Dirk.
Thanks, Kevin. And thanks for the questions, all of you. There's a couple of comments there in the chat to your reference to your comments, Kevin, and I know you'll be picking them up in the working groups. But I need to wrap this part of the dialogue up as we're 4 minutes over, and we have what I'm expecting is going to be a very informative and exciting session afterwards of lessons learned, where we actually hear from some of the entities about their stories and lessons. But I'm going to break here. It's 35. So I'll give you your 10 minutes, and so we'll reconvene at 45 with these lessons learned. So thanks everyone for your contributions and for your questions, and we'll continue in 10 minutes. So welcome back, everyone. I hope you all managed to get an appropriate beverage wherever you're from. And we're moving directly into, I think, one of the probably more interesting sessions here for all of you, which is the lessons learned from the direct access entities in the region. This panel of, I think we have 4 speakers here, will be introduced and be moderated by Clifford Polycarp. Clifford is the Deputy Director of the Division of Country Programming, and in this capacity oversees the pipeline, the programming and pipeline development, and works closely with the regional managers and providing support and guidance to the countries to develop and execute their programming. So I'm going to hand over to Cliff to introduce his panel.
All right, thank you, Pam, and good afternoon to colleagues in the Pacific. Pam, can you confirm that you can hear me well?
I can. You're coming across loud and clear.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so as Pam's mentioned, this session definitely touches on one of the more interesting and important topics that colleagues in the region would be interested in. It's to learn from the experiences of the direct access entities and be able to share lessons across them, and also share lessons and insights that could be useful to prospective direct access entities. As you will be aware, and I think Carolina alluded to it briefly in the morning when she introduced the strategic plan for the GCF for the first replenishment period. The role of the direct access entities is particularly important to the GCF, and we do have an aspiration of significantly increasing the share of direct access entity programming in the GCF portfolio. And it's something that we at the Secretariat spend a lot of time discussing and considering ways in which we can help direct access entities do better with the GCF, bring in more projects, and have a strong performing portfolio with us. So without taking too much time from my side at this stage, let me briefly introduce the panelists who will be sharing their experiences with us this afternoon in the Pacific. And I will then turn to them with some specific questions to be able to bring that experience to bear in this discussion. And of course, throughout the course of this presentation and discussion, I'll do my best to keep it as interactive with all of you as possible. So do keep the questions and comments coming in the chat room, or feel free to raise your hand as you go along. So with that, let me first introduce the panelists. We have today Mr. Mani Mate, the Director of Development Coordination in the division of the Development Coordination Division of the Cook Islands Ministry of Finance and Economic Management. We also have with us Mr. William Koska, Director of the Micronesian Conservation Trust, based in Pohnpei, in the Federated States of Micronesia. We also have Mr. Nafi Palai Takataka, General Manager, Business Risks Services with the Fiji Development Bank. We also have Ms. Melanie King, a Manager, the Program Coordination Unit at the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program, based in Apia, Samoa. And last but not least, we also have with us Pauline Surratt, who's the Climate Finance Officer at the Pacific Community SPC, based in Nomia, New Caledonia. So we have we have a good group of panelists here, which is a rich set of experiences, and we'd like to start with Mr. Mate. If I may ask you to, kindly speak a little bit about how the Cook Islands has gone about engaging the private sector in the development of the country program, and of course MFEM's role within the country program, more specifically to develop some GCF projects. So over to you, Mr. Mark.
Thank you, Clifford. Firstly, greetings to all our participants in this workshop, fellow presenters from other Pacific DAEs, and also I would like to say thank you to GCF for convening this Pacific Dialogue on GCF programming. So one of the key factors that enable the Cook Islands, specifically MFEM, to work and engage with the private sector would be early engagement and partnership between government and private sector. Early on in the readiness stage and the second readiness support, which we received in 2017, we engaged private sector in a range of consultations and workshops to develop, discuss concept ideas that would go towards the country program. This also, during that time, it was also identified need to support the private sector through the accreditation of another entity in the Cook Islands, specifically BCI, to access climate financing to support our private projects. So the early engagement with the private sector was one of the key factors for the Cook Islands that allowed us a good working relationship with the private sector. This has followed on in our current readiness program, which is strengthening the implementation of our country program. We continue to work to develop those partnerships, and our current readiness program have outcomes that is designed to specifically support the private sector. This is through building the capacity of businesses through workshops, both small scale and large businesses alike, to improve their understanding on GCF project development processes and also GCF policies, and also building capacity of the private sector to understand internal Cook Island processes to develop these projects. And we've also worked closely with the Chamber of Commerce, Business Trade Investment Board, in building the capacity of the private sector of businesses to, to go through this process. Furthermore, as I mentioned in the second readiness support, we identified the Bank of the Cook Islands as a possible accredited entity to look after private sector. And during this readiness, the current readiness program, this partnership has continued with support from readiness towards BCI's accreditation. In the early engagement also with the private sector and the development of GCF projects, in our case, concept notes, have been key, is instrumental, involving the private sector at the earliest stage of project development by seeking their input into concept ideas, either through public consultations or targeted consultations and workshops. The early engagement not only does this give us opportunity to gauge if there's interest in private sector to progress with concept notes and projects, but also it gives us a great opportunity to identify any public-private partnership opportunities that may be out there. And also one of the points I want to point out is the early engagement with the private sector allows various stakeholders to follow progress on development of concept ideas, and also it builds trust and forms lasting partnerships. So thank you very much. That's all I have.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Those initial sort of thoughts on how the Cook Islands and MFM in particular have worked with the private sector in the country. I think at some point during the discussion, it'd be interesting to hear an example of a project or a concept that's sort of come out through that process that you as the country believe is going to be quite useful in achieving some of your climate goals. But we'll come back to that in a short while. I haven't seen any questions pop up in the chat room or any hands go up for questions to you. So I'm going to move on to some of the other speakers and then perhaps come back to you during the course of the discussion. So our next speaker will be Mr. Koska from MCT. Mr. Koska, you've recently had the experience of having a SAP, a Simplified Approval Process project approved through the GCF board. Would you be able to share with us your experience focusing, at least on one or two key success factors that allowed MCT to be able to take the proposal through the board, and if you have any advice for other direct tax entities in the region, I'm sure they would value that. So over to you, Mr. Koska.
Yes, thank you very much, Clifford. I wanted to start by sharing that MCT's success and the ability to be able to get a SAP through to the GCF board is actually because of the support that we've received from numerous stakeholders and numerous partners, including the GCF Secretariat, which has provided really strong guidance and support throughout the entire process. And we've had the support of our NDA, the government NDA, who's been there all along, working with us along with the executing entities, the FSM national government, the Department of Resources and Development, and the Department of Environment, Climate Change and Emergency Management, the College of Micronesia, FSM, that has to develop the proposal. And so you know, the success can be alluded to the fact that we have great partners, and that everybody from government, including you know, ourselves and other stakeholders, were fully involved in the development of the project, with the leadership of our NDA, of course. We also received strong support from other partners, such as the USAID Climate Ready Project, which provided some of the consultants to help us develop the proposal. And because as a small organization, the Micronesia Conservation Trust wouldn't be able to develop the proposal ourselves, just using our current staff. We really benefited from that support that we received from the GCF and the Climate Ready support, as well as other organizations like the Nature Conservancy and others that provided some of the science and information that we needed in order to justify or argue the you know, the climate component of our proposal. It was a difficult to sort of distinguish between a regular food security project proposal versus one that was really looking at food security in with the lens of climate change and adaptation. So yes, yeah, for those who are applying for funding, we encourage you to work with as many partners as possible, and to make sure that your government partners are there every step of the way, so that they can support you, and also that they have ownership over the project proposal as you move along. And so, yeah, I guess that's what I will start with. And if there are any further questions, then we will be happy to respond to those. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation, Mr. Koska. And I've you know, heard you flag two. One is sort of strong government support, but also you've emphasized the value of, you know, sort of broad partnerships to enable your success. We may return. I think one of the things that you've been able to overcome is the hurdle that I think ensued in the previous session around the need to provide the necessary climate information to justify the logic of the project. And I think it might be useful if you could come back to that subsequently during the discussion to be able to share MCT's experience and how you overcame that particular issue. In the meanwhile, I'm going to, and colleagues, please, I haven't yet seen any hands go up or comments in the chat room, so I encourage you to please take advantage of this group of panelists to really draw on their experience as much as you can, and ask questions or raise your hand for questions. But for now, I'm going to turn to Mr. Takataka from the Fiji Development Bank, who's also had a recent success with the GCF, maybe a little bit earlier than MCT, but nonetheless, you've also been able to get a SAP project through the GCF approval process. Perhaps you might be able to share your own experience and, again, the success factors that helped you out. And if you can build on Mr. Kotska's success factors, that'd be fantastic. So over to you, Mr. Takataka.
Well, thank you, Cliff. It's nice to meet up again, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you, William and Mani, for your presentation this afternoon. I think my presentation will not be much different from what Mani has expressed in terms of what are the key factors in this journey. So there is a question at the end of the presentation that was sent to me, talk about the key factors of the success of this approved GCF SAP project, and what would be our advice to the Pacific DAs who wants to bring a project forward to the GCF. And if we have time, Cliff, there's a short video clip about this project in Fiji. Since everybody is supposed to be here, maybe it's a good time to showcase Fiji and the project that we are going into. But first up, we had a milestone target in terms of our journey. I think we spent about 6 to 7 years since 2015 in getting into the accreditation process. And up to date, and we did get an approval last year. And it was a really big milestone for Fiji Development Bank down here in the Pacific to have gone through the process of getting accredited through the GCF funding. So it was quite a big journey, and we've learned a lot. And as has been said by Karina in the morning, that we learn by doing, and we actually learn as we progressed in this area. So just to cut the story short, we had a few project pipeline for development in our plans. We had the resilience and energy efficiency home, which was part of our concept note when we did the submission to GCF. And we had a bigger project, the e-transportation, where we want to do electrification of the public transport in Fiji. It was a major project, and it involved a lot of multi-stakeholders discussions, and unfortunately, we didn't really have a private sector partner in this pipeline. So it's still going on, and we're still trying to find the right path, because one of the major concern on that was our risk category. We were sort of above or below the category of risk that we were supposed to fund. And then we finally had this agro PV project. It was a combination of an agriculture project with renewable energy. So it is a private sector initiated project by Envelope. It is a Korean-based company who approached FDB when we announced our accreditation in 2017. So suggestion was made to them to align the project to National Development Plan. There was a plan to establish renewable energy farms in areas around the country in Fiji. But at that time, the Fijian National Development Plan had Ovalau, one of the islands out of our main island, targeted to be 100% renewable by 2030, which the bank advised the Envelope to consider this island. So there was a ready project in place where there was access to climate data, and there was a pre-feasibility study report done by the GGI, the Global Green Growth Institute in Fiji. So it was commissioned by the government of Fiji for the purpose of getting the island to be 100% renewable, which sort of suit the project that we were looking for. So here we had to bring in the agro part to the project and presented it to the GCF. So from a developer and community perspective, having a pre-feasibility study conducted can be a costly exercise, so which is the case was available through the GGI. So that's where we started, and that's where we end, and we submitted the project, which was approved by the GCF in 2020. So overall, again, FDB acknowledges that our success is the result of adopting a participatory approach. So through the developers, the Envelope company in Korea, Korean-based company, the National Designated Authority of Fiji, under the Ministry of Economy, the Ministry of Infrastructure and Transport, Department of Energy, Department of Environment, the Energy Fiji Limited, Ministry of Agriculture, the GCF Secretariat Private Sector Facility Team, and the community of Bureta in Ovalau. They all played a role as expected. So as the co-financer and the GCF credit entity, the Fiji Development Bank had to connect to all stakeholders and ensure that all interests and concerns are fairly addressed. So that is the brief journey that we had, and a lot of experiences, a lot of learning that we went through as we pick up things as we went along. As you know, the GCF, there's a lot of changes. When we started in 2015, the policy kept on changing, and then we had to align our focus in aligning to the new changes that came through the GCF. So that was the journey in summary. But going to the key factors that led to the success of the adoption of the FDB SAP project, we want to talk about having a responsive, dedicated, and knowledgeable private sector partner to take the lead in harnessing the multi-scale stakeholders' participation was a key factor. As you understand that we had to engage a lot of government entities, and they have their own plans, they have their own programs, but to align their programs and having a common interest and a common, a common interest in this project is quite challenging. So we were thankful to the private sector in putting this together and having that perseverance and dedication in collecting all the information, getting everybody together to agree to a certain path. And secondly, aligning to the government priority and the national agenda within the NDA support, and having access to climate change is very, very critical. Without the climate data that we had, we would be struggling to date to complete this process. So it's very, very important that when you want to go into a project, there must be data behind it, especially with the climate data. So lastly, adopting a participatory approach through engagement with the private sector, the community, development partners, local ministries, and government department, and the likes are very important in this type of project. So small advice from Fiji Development Bank to our Pacific DAs. I think first up, you should have a thorough knowledge of the GCF process and very support that is available for the Pacific. Various support programs in the Pacific, the readiness funding, the funding proposal, the modalities, the development of feasibility studies and concept note, access to data, entity work program, and the government priorities. So secondly, to our friends in the Pacific, I think it's important to have a project ready, a concept design with support of the data. It's very important to have that in place so that we can do it simultaneously while we progress with our accreditation journey. We're also preparing ourselves to prepare a project to be funded in this funding. So it was again going back to our milestone. We wanted to go back to GCF within 1 year from approval for our first projects. I think so. I think we did do well in that area, basically because we had a good partnership program with the private sector. So that's this in summary our progress in our journey and our learning through the journey. Maybe if I can play the short video clip, if you allow that, Cliff.
How about Mr. Tak? We end the session with that video. So I'll come back to you before we wrap up the session. It'll be a nice way to end the session is you play the video towards the end. Yeah, I'll come back to you. But thank you, for sharing that experience again from Fiji Development Bank's perspective. And you two have emphasized the value of partnerships, and in this case, the particular partnership with the private sector entity that really served as an anchor in sort of corralling various stakeholders, ensuring the relevant stakeholders were involved, but also the partnerships with the relevant government agencies to be able to get the necessary climate data. But I think the other point you emphasize is to have something, sort of concrete. Having the pre-feasibility through GGI was quite helpful. So thank you for sharing those insights. I think it's been incredibly helpful, and
thank you.
We'll come back to the discussions should there be any questions for you. We're going to now pivot to the sort of next two panelists we have. I'll start, and these are the regional direct tax entities. I'll start with Miss Melanie King from SPREP. Melanie, SPREP was, I think, the first Pacific direct tax entity to be accredited in the region, and you have now a long history with the GCF. Could you share with the group sort of the lessons SPREP has learned, maybe focusing on one of the things that SPREP can do as a regional agency and offers an advantage in working with SPREP as a regional agency, but also maybe perhaps some of the challenges you face, at least focusing on one that affects you as a regional agency. And if you also have any advice for what the GCF could do to help regional agencies like yourself and SPC do better with the GCF would welcome those insights as well. So over to you, Ms. King.
Okay, thank you, Cliff, and talofa everyone. So it's good to reconnect again, even though I think we're getting very tired of Zoom calls, but we'll see how it goes. So breaking this down into the three parts of what we were asked to do, and as Cliff said, we've been accredited now. I think we are the original. There's us and another organisation just going through re-accreditation at the moment. I think we signed off or agreed on the report last night. So really looking at it, one of the key differential advantages, I think, for a regional implementing entity or working at a regional approach, particularly in the Pacific, you know, the SIDS do operate nationally, but there's also a very concerted regionalism here. And I think that's probably unique amongst the SIDS. We have a lot of regional entities that can support the countries. That's what we've been established for. The crop agencies in particular do that. So I think it allows us to combine resources and share resources as well. And then we have this very, single voice that we put out internationally. And I think that allows us to focus or to address some of these key climate issues a lot more targeted. And just having that single voice, I think it provides us with a lot more opportunity and a lot more influence as what a single country might do, because as you know, the scale of countries here varies a lot. So it does allow that to occur. I think then the challenges of working at the regional level, I think the sense of regionalism or this move to focus on regional-based projects can also be a challenge in terms of two things. One, the countries feel disconnected at times on a regional approach. They're very much focused on national priorities. They have to report back to their constituents. And so it's about trying to find the competitive advantage or, you know, the niche of where a country might feel it gets the value from a regional sort of project approach. And so it's also really looking at how do you make them see the advantage for them, but also the equity. And it always comes down to funding. So which is the whole issue of equity in itself is a challenge. But secondly, the other key challenge that we're really finding at a regional level is the capacity of countries to absorb the dollars. So the GCF's not the only funder in the region. And we're getting a lot of feedback around, there's a hesitancy to go over a certain monetary limit on projects because there's just not the capacity within government systems and their financial management systems to absorb large-scale projects. And so that is going to have an impact on, we know we've been talking to the GCF a lot about scaling up. That's from scaling up from pilot projects into larger scale or scaling up across geographical locations. But it's also, there's a big push around programmatic approaches. And so we're getting some hesitancy back from countries to actually, take that leap of faith, if you like. And so maybe one of the ways we need to deal with that, I think, is really rethink how we do our implementation arrangements, which what I'm going to say next may cause some issues with some countries, but there's traditionally the funding comes from the implementing entity straight into the government. And I think for some of these programmatic approaches or these large scale projects, we need to be looking at third parties potentially to actually do the execution on ground, but working very closely with government and the other stakeholders. So because it does just, it's looking at what's important. There's very specific needs, but it's trying to make that happen. And I guess the last one you asked is, what could we request the GCF to do to better support regional entities? A couple of things. The first one is it's not a one size fits all. And the GCF is becoming very formulaic, very template driven, that it's a one size fits all regardless of the region, regardless of the country, regardless of the sector. And taking, for example, the private sector issue, which we've all raised on numerous occasions, but in the presentations earlier, I saw that you want to increase the mobilisation of private finance and you want to increase private sector engagement. And I think there needs to be an understanding from the GCF of the context of the region, of what actually is the private sector out here. And particularly in some countries, there is no private sector. So what does that really mean? And so I think it's about rethinking and adjusting project requirements and this, sort of formulaic push and rethinking what it might mean and different alternatives for in the region. And I guess lastly, I guess we're all here for the next 2 weeks to look at how do we move the pipeline forward. For us, there seems to be this split between country programs and entity work programs. For us, and I'm suspecting also for SPC, SPREP does not take on a project unless it's formally requested to by the NDA. And so that means it comes off their country programs. But what we're finding is it is a challenge moving some of the ideas from the countries into actual viable projects. And so, before they were mentioning climate rationale, even before the climate rationale, we're finding countries are still doing their priorities based on development needs, not on climate needs. So it's really about looking at the climate problem. And so my suggestion to the GCF is really strengthening the country programs, really critiquing them. We get our entity work program critiqued and we end up with projects coming off it. And I think it would be useful for us to ensure that there's more viable ideas coming onto our pipeline, that those country programs are strengthened, and there's a lot greater focus on climate-driven projects. And I think that's something that the GCF can support with. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you, Ms. King, for those suggestions and insights. Absorptive capacity in the countries is a point you've flagged, and I think you said it may be controversial, but having heard Ms. Mate and Mr. Takataka speak, they very much talked about the reliance on partnerships outside of government, including with the private sector, that they see as potentially being either having contributed to their success or see as factors that will contribute to their success going forward. And we also take the suggestions you've made on us being more as a GCF being more sensitive to the differential capacities and the differential needs as we try and sort of develop more guidelines, standards, and codify more the templates and things like that we develop, and also the need for us to invest more in country programs, because for entities like yourself, that is very much the starting point. And if we don't get that right, then it makes it harder for you to get your work program right and your pipeline development right. So thank you very much for those suggestions. I'm going to now invite, and I'm still not seeing any hands go up or questions in the chat room after we've final. Sorry.
I just want to interrupt you because I see one and it's come to me, but I think it was maybe meant generally. And I think it's Mr. Theka who might want to ask this about how GCF can assist in developing a pool of private sector partners. So the person who asked that, would they like to build on it, or are they happy with me just rephrasing their question?
Yeah, probably can just rephrase the question. I think it's clear on what the intention is. Whether because we don't have access to support in terms of private sector involvement. So can GCF provide a listing or provide a pool where we can go to as and when we need support from the private sectors? It's just a question along that line.
And I'll come. Let me take that one, Ms. Takataka, right after we hear from Ms. Sirat from PC, and I'll try and address some of the ways we can support countries and direct tax entities to work with the private sector and support the private sector itself, because GCF is new and different to them. We'll have about 20 minutes after we've heard from Ms. Sirat. So over to you, Ms. Sirat from SDC, if you could similarly share your experience and insights as Ms. King has done, and then we'll go to a discussion. Ms. Sirek.
Hi everyone. So my name is Pauline Sirek and I work at SPC in our climate finance unit here based in Nouméa. I just want to thank first Mrs. Melanie King for what she mentioned in terms of observation of the regional context, but also her suggestions to the GCF. I just want to say that SPC fully support those remarks, and we're fully in line with what you observed in the region. I will try not to repeat what you said and just say that for us, one of the key advantages of working in the region is the fact that, of course, we're close to the country needs. We have a good knowledge of the region. Here at SPC, we have regional offices in different countries in the Pacific. And it's, of course, it's a member-owned organization. So we are try to be as responsive as possible to countries' requests. And we have technical divisions that work in the different fields, so agriculture, fisheries, health, etc. So it helps us having a direct and long-established relationship with the countries, but also to establish good regional partnerships with USAID, MCTs, PrEP, but also FAO and others. One of the key challenges that we face at SPC is our constrained capacity. Such as PrEP, we're serving 14 countries in the region with GCF. But the thing is, we have relatively small teams dedicated to climate finance compared to the needs of all the countries of the region. So our limited capacities are related to human capacities, but also financial capacities to work on concept notes, to organize all the necessary workshops and consultations that need to happen at the very early stages. When I talk about regional DAEs, I also want to talk about NDAs, because most of the government offices we're working with on climate finance have teams of 2 to 3 people maximum, and sometimes just one person who's responsible to deal with all the climate funds, the adaptation fund, the GCF, the GEF, and which is where I fully agree with you, Melanie, on the issue of absorption capacity of the different countries to deal with such an amount of projects. Another key challenge, for the Pacific region, I would say, and we already stressed that in the previous session, but it's the access to the scientific data in the region. Because we have wide and dispersed geographies, even within individual countries, it means the GCF is asking us a broad range of data. Just to give you an example, in one project we're developing, they can ask us what is the observed and projected impact of climate change on the agriculture sector in the FSM state of Yap, which is 100 square kilometers and has 10,000 inhabitants. So as you can see, it can be quite challenging sometimes. So we're very pleased to know that the GCF is developing the GCF WMO Climate Information Portal, which actually brings me to our recommendations to the GCF. What we would be asking is sometimes some flexibility for the GCF to understand that the context in the Pacific is very particular, and that the requirements for data are sometimes a bit stringent to us. So we'd like for the GCF to develop maybe some guidelines as Derek said in the previous sessions, maybe to develop uniform guidelines on minimum acceptable data and parameters to present our climate rationale, and maybe consider some alternative systems of, for example, traditional knowledge that we could include. Also, another suggestion that we'd like to make is maybe trying to find a way to use the readiness funding to strengthen the capacity of DAEs and also NDA, for example, hiring long-term staff to really build on long-term capacity in the region, in the areas of climate change and climate finance. And as it relates to the private sector, as Melanie said, sometimes in some countries there is no private sector, or the private sector is quite undeveloped or really small. So it would be good to receive from GCF kind of a private sector strategy that could include a clear understanding of what the private sector mean and how we could engage with the private sector specifically in the context of Pacific seeds. That would be most useful. I think that's it for me, and I'm open to any questions now. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. And I think you've perhaps built on some of the things that Ms. King has said and reinforced some of them. But since you've also ended on this point on the private sector and the diversity of the private sector in the region, I think there are a few questions that are addressed to GCF, but I also see one that is addressed to the panel. So I'm going to go to the sort of private sector team. Firstly, taking the questions addressed to the GCF, there's one from Ms. Jennifer Henry from the Bank of Cook Islands on whether the GCF is planning an RFP for private sector, specifically in the Pacific. And I think the short answer to that is not immediately. We are doing a review of the RFPs that we've done previously. We did two in the private sector, one mobilizing funds at scale, and that was very much about trying to mobilize the private sector at scale, recognizing that there are some private sector players who will only engage if we have financial instruments or mechanisms that allow them to come in at a certain scale. But we also had an RFP on that was targeting the MSME sector, the micro, medium, and small enterprises sector. So beyond those, we do not have any imminent RFPs planned. And then coming to Mr. Takataka's question about support, there are two principal support programs that we have, and that's the readiness program, which is very much within the control of the countries and the NDAs in the countries to determine how to utilize those resources. They have access to up to $1 million a year. And then the second support program we have is the project preparation facility. Through both these support programs, we've been able to provide support, either to countries or direct tax entities, or through them to the private sector. With countries, we've been able to help them develop private sector strategies and build private sector pipelines in their countries. In some cases, it's just about mobilizing and engaging private sector to see what opportunities exist. With some direct tax entities, we've provided project preparation support to design and develop projects, undertake the necessary studies to be able to bring forward a private sector project to the GCF. So that there are these two support mechanisms, and through that we have been able to support either our direct partners, the NDAs, or the direct tax entities. to develop and engage with private sector and develop private sector projects and pipelines, as well as supporting private sector directly. And then staying on that theme, I see there's a question addressed to the panel, and I'm not sure if there's someone who would like to pick up on this theme of programming with the small and medium enterprises. This is from Alvin. Noting the diversity of private sector in the Pacific region, could you speak to the experience on programming with SMEs? I'm not sure if I could come to you, Mr. Mate, on that question, given that you did involve the private sector in the country programming exercise. If you could speak more specifically to the engagement with SMEs. Mr. Mate, could I put that question to you?
Yes, certainly. So I think our experience with small medium enterprises is we need to tailor the projects. We need to look at the scale of the projects and make sure that it's something that our private sector is able to take on, and it's not too it matches the scale of our private the size of our private sector in country. Instead of coming up with big projects that require a lot of investment, small businesses in the Pacific are quite limited on the amounts that they can invest. So I think it's matching the scale of the projects to the types of businesses and the size of our private sector. It's important.
Thank you, Mr. Mate. I see there's another question that's now related to the country programs from Peter King. Peter, the GCF has earlier this year in February updated our country program guidance. So the question is, do we have any intention of providing firmer country program guidance? We did so earlier in the year, and there was more guidance provided, particularly in terms of the project pipeline needing information that gave us a sense of the theory of change, but in a fairly succinct way, and also seeks to address the climate problem, or clarify the climate problem that the intended pipeline in the country program was seeking to address. So there is a firmer guidance, if you may, in that document compared to what we've had previously. Could there be ways in which we could strengthen that further? Certainly, and I think with the experience we'll gain as countries use the guidance that was released earlier this year, we could revisit and update the guidance in the next year or two. But we want to just gain some experience from the guidance that was put out earlier this year. We could do supplementary annexes to the guidance where needed, and that's something we're looking at as well. The next question I have is from Melanie from SPREP, but she's channeling this question from Sefa of UNEP, and it's addressed to Willie from MCT. Melanie, do you wanna say the question out loud for everyone?
Yeah, thank you, Clifford. This is Sefa from
Sefa.
UNEP.
Perfect. You can go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just a question for Willie. The Micronesia Trust covers 3 countries, FSM, Palau, and RMI. I just wanted to see if you can just share what makes FSM successful and not as many projects in Palau and Marshall Islands, if he is able to. Thanks, Willie.
Thank you, Seva. I think that question is really to the NDA, Belinda Hatley, who's also on the call. I think it's just basically because AFSM has been very proactive, and if you recall, the FSM was I think one of the first countries to submit a country program strategy, along with a number of I think 13 project ideas, and so they've been quite involved with this process. I think much more so than their neighbors. But yeah, it's just that the NDA has been very active, actively going after the projects.
Thank you.
Thanks, Willie. I don't know, Belinda, if you want to compliment Willie here before we move on.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Clifford. I'm not sure if the question is really directed to us because we only have one project approved to date, and it seems like the question mentioned about having lots of projects.
That's right. I think the question is more about how come FSM was able to get ahead, and I think Willie's addressed that to some extent in the sense that FSM was one of the first countries in the region to develop its country program, and that contributed to it. So as a success factor relative to some of the other countries in MCT's projects, other country projects in MCT's pipeline. So I thought if you wanted to add to that, if not, that's fine. But the groundwork that you did early on as a country seems to be a key factor.
Thank you. Nothing to add. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Belinda. I do not see any other hands or any further comments on the chat. I don't know if I've missed any, Pam, or if any's come to you directly. If not, then we can. We have about 5 more minutes. We could then turn straight to the video if there's no other questions or comments. Pam, have I missed anything?
I'm not seeing anything in addition. You got the question for Willie
Yep.
Yeah. So no, we're up to date, Cliff. We're up to date.
Fantastic. Okay. All right. Why don't we then invite you, Mr. Takataka, to share the video you wanted to share, and then we'll wrap up the session with that. And I want to thank, before you do that, I want to thank the panelists for joining us this afternoon, for sharing their experience, sharing some very useful insights for other direct tax entities in the region, and some very valuable suggestions for the GCF as well. Thank you to all of you, Mr. Mate, Mr. Koska, Mr. Takataka, Ms. King, and Ms. Seret for your contributions this afternoon. And we look forward to continuing this dialogue regarding how we improve and strengthen our work with direct tax entities in the region during the course of the coming days. With that, Mr. Takataka, do you have the video ready to go?
Yes, Cliff, thank you for allowing the opportunity to show the video. It was put together by the Central Bank of Fiji in association with the AFI program. So it's slightly looked at from a different perspective, but I think it showcases the agro PV project that was funded by GCF and FDB. I hope you enjoy the video. Thank you.
Hola, and welcome to Ovalau, home to Fiji's first World Heritage Site and old capital, Evuka. Ovalau is famous for many Fijian firsts, and thanks to enabling policies by the Reserve Bank of Fiji, the island now adds another, with Fiji and the South Pacific's first agro-photovoltaic project, brought to them through the Fiji Development Bank with funding by the Green Climate Fund, Koika, and Envelops Limited.
Agro-photovoltaics is an innovative system which allows for solar power generation and agriculture to coexist on the same piece of land that would otherwise be in competition with one another. For solar
We've lost the audio, Mr. Takataka. Could you unmute your...
Gas emissions.
Thank you.
Simultaneously, the project is expected to yield over 100,000 kilograms of crops annually, improving food security and creating additional sources of income for Ovalau's communities.
It's quite difficult because Ovalau used to know it's a lot of rocks, yeah? And if you're gonna start with that farming, will feed all the people of Ovalau.
In the long term, the project also aims to contribute to a change of perception livelihoods, and advancement of women in the local communities, which will empower women and girls for better participation in economic and development activities.
In terms of the Gender Action Plan, we have opportunity for women from the Bureta community to be able to be employed or to be taught on how to do electrical maintenance work. So that's a great opportunity both for the women and the young people of the community in Bureta. And when we actually shared this during our consultation on the island, they were very receptive to this kind of opportunity that will be available from this project. I think Ovalau is a lucky island. And now if you're going to start with that project again, mostly for women, I wish I go back to young again to go there.
In fulfilling its commitment to the Maya Declaration and the Sharm el-Sheikh Accord, RBF is a front-runner in inclusive green finance, leading the charge in sharing knowledge globally across the AFI network and in the region as part of PIRI, the Pacific Island Regional Initiative.
Thank you. Thank you for that video. And there's a request for you to share that video on the Wuva app. So if you could do that, that'd be fantastic. But thank you once again to you, Mr. Takataka, for sharing the video and to the panel for their contributions this afternoon. I'm going to turn it back to you, Pam.
Thanks, Cliff. Thanks a lot. And thank you to all the panelists. So all that remains for me on this day one, quite a full and interesting day one, is to share with you some of the takeaways, just to remind you. We're just pulling together some notes at the end of the day of some of the takeaways. These will be the notes will be available for you sort of on the Hoover, and also we'll be obviously putting together sort of an informal report at the end, which will be available to you. But just I very quickly, forgive me, apologies in advance for the terrible presentation here, but I've just quickly put these bullets, comments into a slide so that you don't just have to listen to me, you can see some of them, but we do have notes for you. So I'm going to quickly share this slide with you as I go through what some of the takeaways have been for the day. So obviously we heard from this morning, we were very grateful and thankful for the opening from PAR and then from Mr. Hussein, who provided this overview on the progress to date and persevered with us through his technical problems and the increase in GCF investments in the Pacific since previous structured dialogues. Seeing that the GCF funds are dispersed and projects moving into implementation, and the benefits really can be experienced on the ground. For Fiji, the process of BIN accreditation has been a priority. It was a lengthy process, he said, but it was worth the effort. A lot of challenges still there, but getting the support from GCF, including the readiness program, is really helpful. And there's an interest in continuing using the readiness to develop the learning and knowledge platform for the region. From Caroline on the update of the GCF strategic plan and priorities from the board, they will continue to contribute to the Paris Agreement goals. Noted that the portfolio targets need to increase to funding direct access entities as well as private sector funding, but a few questions on the private sector funding, and we've heard more about that, and I think it's also scheduled into the program later for other questions around that. GCF's responses to the independent evaluation units and the work in SIDS, and notice that GCF has developed a management response to that, which has been shared with the board. And GCF continues to provide support in the area of loss and damage, and mainly through that readiness and the project preparation facility. So quick snapshot from for the Pacific portfolio from Sam. GCF funding 16 projects in the region and investing $440 million in the Pacific. And the current pipeline is under development. It's a very ambitious one with 114 projects, and the majority of them now reflected in country programs, demonstrating a high level of country ownership. There are some gaps, but these are being worked on, and the ambitions might be higher than what currently can be supported by the entities working in the region. And we heard that reinforced by Melanie too, in the sense of the ability of countries the capacity to absorb some of this. Kevin, gave us an interesting introduction to some of the latest scientific tools available, and especially the GCF partnership with the WMO. And that generated quite a lot of interest, and particularly this desire for a bit more guidance and clarification on what information is needed, so you can streamline and get on the same page with the kind of information that is required to support projects. We had then we got the lessons learned, very interesting lessons learned here from some of the entities about how they are succeeding with private sector engagement, and noticing that it's important to get very early engagement and co-creation, working with a broad number of partners. And also he mentioned that idea of getting broad stakeholder with different ministries and different people, the real co-creation of all the stakeholders involved. Then Willie spoke about the success of the approved SAP, and noticed that much of their success stemmed from getting support from a broad range. Again, that reaffirmation that it's a broad range of partners that's helpful. And then Mr. Takataka gave his advice about getting thorough knowledge about GCF and the opportunities there, using the readiness program and other support available, and encouraging entities who are going through it to get support and concept design, and then also development through the same time as accreditation, to sort of streamline the process. Again, reinforcing that it's a lot of work and it's effort, but in the long run, it was worth the effort. Comments from Melanie King at SPREP. The challenge of working at the region, because it sometimes competes with national sort of development interests, development plans and interests and focus. But it's important to get that, what she called the competitive advantage of working across countries and regionally. She mentioned the equity issues regarding funding, and called for GCF to put more focus on strengthening country programs, and recognizing that some of these countries are really quite particular and unique, and a one size fits all doesn't necessarily work for them, and ensuring stronger alignment with these projects, especially with climate science, climate change, and making sure that they're not focused on development, but rather on climate change issues. I think that was pretty much all of them there, my comments. As I say, we'll be capturing these and they'll be made available to you. And I thank you all for your contributions. And again, warm thank yous to all of our speakers for today. In the next session, we'll be looking at more details on, just let me grab my notes here in terms of the next session, more details on drilling down into some of those lessons learned. So that this will be on Thursday, the 10th, looking at a bit more detail of the readiness and preparatory support programs, those that have been mentioned as success factors, getting more lessons learned of how entities have worked with the readiness resource, with technical assistance, project preparation. And we'll be learning more also about lessons learned from some of the direct entities in their work, and especially then a broad discussion with international accredited entities. So that all sounds fascinating, and I wish you best of luck in enjoying all of that on Thursday. I won't be with you, but I'll have another colleague supporting that. So thank you all, and I think we're wrapping up for today.